I'm gonna come over and translate. There's
Yeah.
there's
Okay.
sandwiches in the back there. She's really nice.
Okay, se va a So, I'm a professor here in this department, and many of you I work with very closely. For the last 10 years, I have been obsessed with questions of enforcement of labor laws. I teach a class here. I've written many, many papers. I did a national survey of state departments of labor and the new local departments of labor, all about how they enforce these laws. And the interesting thing is that our movements fight to pass these laws. We put all our heart and soul into passing these laws. And then our frustration is that we don't know what's going to happen in terms of enforcement and implementation. And so I share very much the spirit of what so many of you have said. And Jenn is my partner in crime. And she has been in the position of running enforcement for an agency. And together, she will tell you about herself, but together we have spent a lot of time doing a very deep dive into these issues around enforcement. We work all over the country with state and local departments of labor. I did a 5-year survey with departments of labor trying to understand how they thought about enforcement. And if anything, that study convinced me even more that we're passing these very forward-thinking policies and we're hitching them to these very backward enforcement regimes. And one of the things that I wanted to say to all of you is that the very first minimum wage law was passed in 1912 in Massachusetts. And when that law passed, the legislature said, we will only pass this law if you agree that the only enforcement that will be done will be through the court of public opinion.
Oh.
What was that? That the only enforcement that will be done will be through the court of public opinion. So what I want people to realize, right, is that the fight over enforcement is a way that those who oppose our laws relitigate the case, right? Does that make sense?
Of course.
And so, this has been going on for a very long time. And one of the things that Jenn and I learned is that sometimes we pass these laws, organizers, we pass these great laws, but then when Jenn and I look at the actual wage and hour statutes, when you look at like the details, we discover that a lot of the most important strategies for enforcement are made very difficult by the existing laws. So that's why this is really hard. That's why we're all so frustrated. And we know that a big part of changing the culture of these agencies like that, we can do some work with them on how they can do things better, but it's really about organizing and pushing them to make these changes. And these are, very old and entrenched bureaucracies.
Yeah, so like Janice said, before I started working with CWO, I was the head of enforcement at the Seattle office of labor standards. So it's a different beast, right, because it's a city. We were lucky because we got to build it from the ground up, and we were able to do that in partnership with community partners and worker organizations. But through that process, through creating and building an office and the processes and procedures, I learned a lot. and solve kind of from the inside the struggles even progressive governments with a lot of tools and good laws have. And so then taking a step back and being able to look at other states like New Jersey and see, you know, the problems that you all are having and kind of apply the lessons that I learned has been a really interesting, you know, thought experiment, but also has been helpful for us to sort of pinpoint where changes can be made and, you know, where things can be moved so that enforcement can be improved and the laws can be effective.
And per your question, Seattle has a very extensive co-enforcement setup, and we will describe that, and we will also describe California, okay? So also, Jenn has written many papers, and we have 3 of them here. Oh, you have them there. But anybody who didn't get them, there's more here. But also, if you go on the Rutgers Labor Standards Toolkit on site, you can see a whole bunch of papers. And there's one that's just for you that we should have printed out and given to them. Maybe we'll get them.
Well, email it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a paper that we did that's about what organizers need to know about the powers that they want enforcement agencies to have and use. Okay? Okay. So what we were gonna, and let me just say, there are certain people in this room who know a great deal about these issues and know a great deal about the ins and outs of New Jersey law. And so what I want to do is paint the big picture, put out some basic ideas, and then let's have a conversation and a strategy session together, okay? Okay, so we know that non-compliance levels are very high with minimum wage. I do not need to go into this with you, okay? So I'm just gonna stipulate to this and keep going, okay? So is someone gonna translate, or?
Yeah, I'm coming.
Who are going to? Okay. All right, sorry. One thing you might be interested in knowing, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is that when the Fair Labor Standards Act was written in 1938, at that time when the law was written, the assumption was government would never be able to enforce it by itself. And the original draft of the law had unions and community organizations working in partnership to enforce the law in their labor markets. But the Roosevelt administration did not feel that they could pass that law, and what was eventually put into place was much weaker than the original draft. Just interesting. So we also know that enforcement is not working because we have decreasing funding with an expanding mandate. And we have growth in the hardest to police sectors and among the hardest to protect workers. This is a little bit about New Jersey. This slide is a little bit old, but there are 10 supervisors, 50 investigators, a ratio of about 1 to 4,000, and about 12,000 complaints a year. So just useful for you, and you have all this, you know, in your, okay. So what we thought we would do is start with why complaint-based enforcement does not work. We know that you know why, but we wanted to show you how what the research shows about why complaint-based enforcement doesn't work. This is something that we show state departments of labor and investigators to sort of have them, you know, sort of get it, okay? All right, so we know, right, that those people who are most likely to come forward, who are most vulnerable to wage theft and accidents are less likely to come forward, right? Even when they know their rights, right? Okay. But we have a system that's overwhelmingly based on complaints, okay? Right? So, and that's partly what I was trying to say to you before. That was not the original idea of the minimum wage law federally in 1938. But it's what has happened all across the country now. Everything is complaint-based. There's a famous study that a colleague did about why complaint-based enforcement does not work. And I'm gonna show it to you, okay? So the first thing was that what he found was that there was very little relationship between the number of violations that were coming in different sectors, the number of violations that were happening in different sectors, and the number of complaints that were coming in. You might ask, how did they know that? They used the the ACS, they used the census. The reason why that's cool is that the census asks workers, how many hours did you work last week and how much were you paid for them? Okay? So it's a worker self-report, right? So that's really good. So they took that data, and that data let them see, right, what was the relationship between what workers were saying and where complaints were coming from. Are you following me so far? Does this make sense? Okay, so here's what happened. Here's what they learned is that I want you to think about this. This is a 2-square chart, and I will explain it to you. Don't worry. In quadrant 1, this is a quadrant where there's a lot of complaints, but we know from the study that there's also high violations. Okay? So if all the complaints were falling into quadrant 1, we would not have a problem. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay? But what about quadrant 2? That's where the study told us that there were a lot of underlying violations, but very low complaints. Okay? So that means that if you have only a complaint-based system, you will not you will not deal with the violations. Yes?
What does the CR stand for?
Complaint rate.
Complaint rate.
Yeah. So quadrant 3 is the quadrant where you have a lot of complaints, but actually the sectors don't have that many violations. So this is a sector where the workers feel very empowered to complain, and that's great, but actually it's not a sector that's really a problem, right? And the last quadrant is low complaints and low violations. So what we need to worry about, where we need to focus our resources, are quadrants 1 and quadrants 2, right? But we can't get to quadrant 2 if we're going through complaints. Does this make sense? Okay? So what we have offered to New Jersey is that we could do this study for the state and identify the violation rate so that then we could do this, right, and do a breakdown for them so that we know that they are concentrating in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2.
When I see quadrant 2, I like an industry that we have worked, like I can imagine why there is low complaints internally, no? Like, for example, like the bureaucracy of the institution, like access to language barriers. Now, for example, lack of documents play a very key role. But in the study, this means we internally like going through members like why they don't file complaints. But in your study, like why you have found like it is the factors of having in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, like what are the factors that
They just asked people, right? In other words, this is a census survey. So they didn't ask people why they weren't complaining. They just asked them, how many hours a week do you work? How many hours a week are you being paid for? Right?
Do they
So-
ask what industry they're working in too? I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
So I just mean, we think that it's the same reasons that you just said, right? Same reasons. But the idea, right, is that we've all known that a lot of low-wage workers who feel vulnerable are not gonna complain, right? Not to mention the fact that if the state is not enforcing anti-retaliation, and so people are afraid of losing their jobs or being targeted by ICE, they're not gonna come forward. So we know, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting about this study is it's helpful when we present it to agencies because we can show them, listen, you know, and we can show them the numbers. So for example, Jen and I just worked on a study about San Francisco. And it is just undeniable, like the violations against domestic workers, for every one complaint they get, we estimated that 5,000 plus people have suffered wage theft, right?
Minimum wage violation.
Minimum wage violation,
Violation.
right? One complaint, but 5,000 violations underlie that one complaint. So the idea, right, is that I just want to say we are not crazy, right? That, and the issue is that if agencies are spending all their time, all their capacity
Just respond.
on complaints and not targeting the sectors where we know there was a lot of violation, that is the disconnect.
Yep.
Okay? So the reason why we're doing the work we're doing is to try to do something about that problem, is to try to take the capacity that does exist in these agencies and direct it correctly. So I'll just say a little bit about that, and then we'll keep going, okay? Whoops, sorry. Okay. This, you don't have to memorize it, again, it's on your chart, but the reason why this is important is what we say to agencies is how they should treat complaints differently depending on the quadrant. So you remember this quadrant was the one where there's not a lot of complaints and there's not a lot of non-compliance? Remember that? Would we want them to spend time investigating those complaints? No, right? We would want them to do the bare minimum so that they had capacity left over for the juicy, important stuff, right? So, so we really want them to focus in on quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. And we want them to do aggressive enforcement in those quadrants, right? But we want them to have capacity left over to do strategic enforcement, which means targeting the sectors with the highest violations, not waiting for a complaint, proactively targeting those sectors, okay? So strategic enforcement is really simple. It means targeting investigations where evidence shows that labor law violations are the greatest. And I just told you how we do that, right? How we figure out where they are. In industries where workers are most likely to be mistakenly or deliberately cheated out of their wages. And it's the idea that you have enforcement policy that allows the agencies to focus their resources on the workplaces, the companies, and the industries where the biggest problems are. Okay? So, these are things like how they decide which industries and which segments of those industries to focus on. Decisions about which companies within the sector they should focus on. Which workplaces. And then which tools to use. And then which organizations they should partner with. And the idea of strategic enforcement is to create ripple effects, right? It's the idea that, yes, we know that we'll never have enough investigators, right, to be cops on the beat in every workplace. what we know, right, is that if we choose our targets correctly and we really come down on them, then we can have an impact on other firms in the sector. So strategic enforcement is based on the idea that that's what we need to do, is that we need to do enforcement in a way that that accomplishes deterrence more broadly in the labor market. Does that make sense? And that is not at all the way agencies operate now. Yeah.
And thinking about that is that two of the hardest things, domestic workers and landscapers, two industries which are horrible, but they're small, they're always small employers.
Yeah.
And for example, I filed a lot of domestic worker complaints, and the agency doesn't investigate them, they just send them straight over to the hearings. But, and to some degree, I don't know what to do about that, because on the one hand, yeah, it is a small, but it's like everybody's violating the law in the domestic. Not everybody. I met one domestic worker that had it done right, but not many.
Jen and I did some work with Seattle and some other places, thinking through creative ways to enforce in those sectors. And I can, why don't we come back to that, and I'll throw out some ideas. But I'll just say that I think that there are things that can be done. In Seattle, they set up a wage standards board.
Yep.
And now people are coming together to figure out what enforcement in the sector might look like. And one of the things that I have long thought is that that there should be a process whereby the agencies that place domestic workers and the employers who hire them should have to register and go through a training and sign something that says that, you know, they understand that they have to provide, you know, minimum wage and overtime and, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? Likewise, that domestic workers should belong to an organization and in many ways have that organization supported by the city or government, right? So for example, if the workers are going to a training, that the organizations be paid to provide that training, that they be given that training on company time, right, on their employer's time, that that in many ways, right, and that in a lot of ways we know that an organized labor market is a more compliant labor market, and we want the city and the state to support, however they can, organization, right? So if it's union organization, that's great. If it's other kinds of organization, that's great too. But since these organizations spend so much time helping workers file complaints and fight employers and that kind of stuff, what we want to do is resource those groups. So for example, in Seattle and in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, organizations are funded for the outreach and the work that they do and the training that they do with workers. They are funded by the city or by the state for the work that they are doing. And part of what Jen and I fight for strongly is that they not only should be funded, but also that they need to be included in investigations. A lot of what we see happen is that organizations bring cases to agencies. The agencies say, thank you very much, and then they won't share information with them as the investigation is proceeding. And that is a huge problem and one that is not necessary. And so part of what we've been doing is trying to get them to understand why they need to share information and how they can do it within the confines of the law. So creating ripple effects means increasing the cost of non-compliance by using all the tools that an agency has. So for example, the Department of Public Health in San Francisco, if a restaurant has a wage theft violation against them and it is unpaid, they have their license taken away. So how can we connect these issues to licensing? Right? So, and not just in restaurants, but in these other sectors, like the car wash industry. In Los Angeles, the car wash industry, and New York City too, they have to put up a bond, right, at the beginning when they register, because there has to be money available to workers when they go out of business or they haven't paid. And they can only get out of posting the bond if they have a collective bargaining agreement. So it's like, how can you use the law to support worker organizing, right? But what we do with the agencies is we try to get them to think about every single piece, every tool they can possibly use to increase the cost of non-compliance, right? So that, because we all know, right, that employers do a cost-benefit calculation, and that if the violation cost is low, they're going to violate the law. But if we raise the violation rate, then that's, makes it harder for employers to do that. So Jen is going to explain what we've been doing with the agencies. And Jen, the only issue is it's very hard to read this.
Yeah.
So I think you should read it off of a piece of paper so you're not trying to. Yeah. Here, I'll give you the.
So enforcement has various stages, right? So it's easier if you think about it in different stages, and then you can try to map out the tools. And this is important for you all to know so that you can push New Jersey, right, into making sure that they are using all of the tools at their disposal and trying to think outside of the box, right? It's not always just reading your earned sick leave law and saying, what does this say I can do? It's like Janice said, where are there other leverage or pieces of power that the agency can use to get employers to comply and to get employers to pay, right, whenever they have been found to be in violation? So starting with the first stage, pre-investigation intake. The first is strategic outreach, right? And so strategic outreach for me means that you need people who actually have direct communications and the trust of vulnerable workers, right? It's not government people going out and handing out flyers. It's government funding organizations like you all who already have these contacts, who already have the trust of communities where we know these violations are happening. And you're going out, and as part of your, your other organizing events or your other outreach events, you're also telling that people about their rights and how they can have their rights enforced and what resources they have to make sure those rights are being complied with, right? So get, pushing New Jersey, one, to get funding for that type of outreach. Yeah.
Well, I just want to make note, I don't know how much we talked about this, but I just want to make sure everyone knows that in the earned sick leave law.
Yeah.
Were you going to mention this?
No, yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that was written into the statute, right? And
Yeah.
this is something we've talked about at the coalition table. It's not a lot of money,
How much
especially
is
for
it?
the whole state. It's $600,000 a year.
Okay.
And at this point, it's, as far as we understand it, it's going to be focused just on outreach and education, so.
Great.
How
Well,
much
no,
more
that's
it'll
not
be-
great in the sense
I mean,
that we
it's-
want it for
Yeah,
investigation
for
too.
more,
but okay.
right.
Yeah.
Right, so, I just wanna add that, 'cause
That's
it's
great,
exactly
yeah.
what I'm about.
Thank you for adding it. Right, so strategic outreach, right? So good, you have funding, you can always press for more. We'll talk a little bit about this, but at Seattle, when the Office of Labor Standards started, the first thing that happened was we hired a community outreach liaison, a community-based organization liaison, right? That person was the connection to all of the organizations that we then funded. There was a $1.5 million per year.
Wait, what?
Yeah. I think it actually was 1 million the first year, and then it went up to 1.5. But so one other idea to think about is, and this goes to the question of institutionalizing these changes. How do you make sure that if a Christie comes back, that everything doesn't go away? Is fighting for a position within the office who is going to be the contact person and who's going to be the voice of the coalition, right? And in Seattle, we hired that person first. And that person was good, but they didn't actually have the trust of the community orgs because they came from a different place. And what happened eventually was one of the person from one of our community partners came and filled that position. So she already had the trust of everybody. She was one of the community organizers. She came and she was able to change the way that the agency worked with the contracts. She changed the reporting requirements. I don't know how many of you work with government, but government wants a lot of reporting. They want a lot of paper. They want a lot of boxes checked. And she came in and said, listen, this is ridiculous. This is not helpful, and changed the way reporting happened, right? So she was able to be at every meeting the voice of our community partners and centered them every time we were talking about enforcement, every time we were talking about funding, every time we had any conversations. So I think that's super important to have that person embedded. Sectoral mapping, right? So sectoral mapping is looking at an industry and saying, where are the leverage points? How are we going to get those ripple effects? So what you want to do is you want to say which industries are in quadrant 2, right? Which industries are high violation, low complaints, and then which employers in those industries can we look at to see if they're violating the law, use them as an example, and then get other employers to say, oh, well, like if I violate, that's going to happen to me. I'm going to owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. Proactive investigations is a part of that, right? So not just doing complaint-based, looking at which employers are bad actors that are going to have those ripple effects, and then proactively investigating. Preliminary interviews. I understand that New Jersey does not interview workers, right? Which is very problematic. But what you want the agency to do is interview workers, but you really want the agency to be interviewing workers before the investigation starts. And that once an investigation gets going, it can take a lot of the agency's resources. And so the agency wants to make sure when it, with its community partners, that before it starts this case, that it's a priority, that it's a good use of their resources. And one way to do that is to get referrals from community organizations and to talk to those workers, right? And to make sure that what they're saying is a violation, that there's evidence, and that you can get those workers to, that you have enough people to come forward to make that case if it goes to litigation, right? Building a strong case before you initiate. And that can be done a lot with community partners, right? So the community partner can build this case for the agency and bring it to the agency. What the agency needs to do then is look at that evidence and then start talking to those employees, right? So the preliminary interviews are important. Triage is, you're always going to have too many complaints. The agency is never going to have enough investigators. So the idea is, look, you get a complaint and you say, does this fall within our priorities, right? So what does that require? One, setting priorities. And those priorities need to be set with all of you. Which cases are important to the agency? Well, quadrant 1 we know is important, right? High violation, high complaint. You do want to spend resources on industries where there's high violations. But do you want to spend resources on a complaint where the person is making $120,000 a year? No, right? You want to focus on low-wage workers. You want to focus on vulnerable workers. You want to focus on violations that are ongoing, right? You want to focus on violations that have generally impacted multiple people, right? So setting your priorities and then deciding, does this complaint fit our priorities? And if it doesn't, then we're either not going to act on it, or we're going to do something that doesn't require as many resources, like conciliation. This might be where someone calls the employer and says, listen, the agency calls the employer and says, we have an employee here who says you've violated their rights. You can pay them now and we'll go away, or we might not. And most of the time, this is something we did a lot in Seattle, most of the time the employer pays, right? The employer wants the agency to go away. So, and that takes way fewer resources than starting an investigation, and getting into the whole thing. So you want to use the amount of resources equivalent to the priority of the complaint. I'm going to skip to allow third-party and anonymous complaints. Right, so a third-party complaint might be coming from one of you all. We understand that this employer is in violation of the law because we've heard this from X amount of people. We also want the agency to allow anonymous complaints, especially if they're not enforcing retaliation, but people who can report a complaint and the agency will take that complaint even if the person won't give the agency their name, right? And that's gonna be an important time for the agency to do preliminary interviews to make sure that it's actually a case. But you don't want, a lot of agencies say, if they don't tell us their name, we throw it away, right? We don't even look at it. That's just bad policy.
So, question, is there like a
Yeah.
best practice for doing third-party complaints? Because we've had like mixed responses. I think with NJDOL, as you mentioned before, there's no transparency at all. They just talk with the employer.
Yeah.
With OSHA, we developed a relationship where it's a little bit more open, but still that's even kind of closed. Not even talking about EEOC yet, which still seems like it's kind of up in the air for us, but
Right.
like if it exists out there, what is the best model?
Right, so what Seattle does, and this was a process we came up with, was we created a form, right? And it was as simple as that. It just says, an employee who makes a complaint can sign a piece of paper that says, I want this organization to be my representative. And we would accept that form, and that organization became the equivalent of an attorney, right? And so we would communicate with the organization, with the advocate, like we would instead of the worker, essentially. So we are feeding the organization the information, and then the organization would get in touch. Because usually it's multiple workers, right? Get in touch with the workers to keep them informed. So if you can create a process where you are the point of contact, and this isn't easy to do. The pushback from agencies is always, well, like how can you talk to an organization like they're not a lawyer? What about client-attorney privilege? Well, the agency doesn't have client-attorney privilege with anyone. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? And the agency is always talking to accountants and HR people with the employer as if those people are the employer. So you want the equivalent on the employee side, right? So if you can, and we talked about this actually with.
So you guys have a paper here?
Yeah. Sorry.
Rewind 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, getting the form, you have the
Yes,
form.
that's good.
The form and then,
The relationship.
oh, the relationship, okay, yeah, sorry. So you want the equivalent relationship on the employee side as you have on the employer side, right? So say that again. The agency is talking to the employer's accountant, an HR person, and other people who are not lawyers as if they are the employer, right? So the equivalent on the employee side is the employee may not have a lawyer, but they may have an employee advocate, right? An advocacy organization who is their representative. And so why can't the agency treat that organization the same way they would treat a representative for the employer side, right? And so creating something as simple as that process and that procedure can create a lot of transparency. Now, it's not perfect, right? Like there are still certain things the agency might not be able to disclose because of confidentiality laws and stuff like that. But it's at least a way to create that process and get your foot in the door. And yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, but
Go ahead.
how you make that happen? Like how?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
do you have to pass a law?
No.
Do you have to like how you make the agency create this form and make this happen?
That's what we're gonna do. That's what
Yeah.
we're gonna do. That's what we're here for. Sorry.
That's the
Yeah,
thing.
that's
There are many things that, you need a law to do, but many of the things in the stuff we're giving you, you just have to organize and kick their ass.
Okay.
So
Right?
that's
Right?
no,
It's
but I
not-
just want to
yeah.
add, like, part of what we're going to do after we do this presentation is we're going to talk about this. We're going to say this is something we want to do, and we're going to work
Yeah,
together to figure out how we make it happen. Go ahead.
So right on the complaint form, right, there'd be a thing where workers could designate their organization. Right, so that they would designate the organization and then they get this form, right, that Jen is talking about.
But I think it's just having, the power that will be recognized as a valid statement, right? So like, the forms already have a checkoff for a third party,
Right.
but unless we're the lawyers.
But
not
then I
really-
think the thing is, what you have to do is get into the specifics of what that means,
Right.
right? And do an MOU that says, okay, we're putting this on the complaint, right? We're being recognized as third party, and that means that you, right? And it's a series of things that the agency commits to doing, and like.
How do they interpret that now when they check the form? What does that mean for them?
Not too much, I mean.
What part of the form?
It's a
The wage and hour, NJDOL form.
You sign it on behalf
I've
by,
noticed that it
you know,
depends
by
on the
anyone
investigator.
No, no, no.
with
It
whom
depends
they
on the
wish.
investigator.
I'm not
So-
sure, but I think it varies by investigator.
this
So I've
is-
had investigators who will disclose a lot of information
Yeah.
to me. They don't send us copies of things, which is like always my frustration. So like I'm always calling, you know, like 2 weeks after somebody has missed a deadline because they didn't get the form or they couldn't understand it because it's not Spanish. But, so some of the investigators will disclose a decent amount of information and others won't. I don't know if that's
So this
everyone
is
else's
super
experience.
common, right? We see this all over where it's investigator by investigator, and that's incredibly problematic, right? And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times that's because investigators don't actually know what they're allowed to share. So it's training and education, right? And that usually has to come from the top. But like, you know, I don't know if you've done this, but like trying to talk to the manager or the supervisor, whomever's overseeing that person about this discrepancy. Have you done that? Have you talked to them?
No.
Right, but
Not
okay,
yet.
so that you know, you might need to start at the top. But this was happening in California, right? This one of the first things that Janice will talk about. But when the new commissioner came in, she was like, it was about giving information to people. It was like, this is what's allowed, this is what you can do, because there's a lot of fear and concern, and these kind of like unspoken, it's like the status quo, right? These unspoken rules about what you can't do, but nobody knows why or where it came from. And so making sure that investigators know they can share that information, I think is, you know, a fundamental step that needs to happen, right? Like, so investigator gets that form, they need to know, what does it mean when this box is checked? Who do I talk to?
I just don't want them to clarify and find out that they're not supposed to tell me.
Right, yeah, no, that's.
There's two questions here, so Anna, and then can you tell me your name one more time?
Audio.
Audio, okay, go ahead.
Well, it's more of a comment, but just to speak to the, first of all, like Lou mentioned, we are starting to work with context over the EEOC in there to file complaints around racism on the job or sexual harassment. And one of the things that's critical to having some sort of a transparency with the investigator is that it could easily limit particularly a charge of sexual harassment to the individual who decided to come forward. And so what we've been kind of mulling over is how integral it is to already have an organized base of workers on the ground ready to say, this is a problem, but I've personally really been struggling with how and when to really I don't want to use the phrase pull the trigger, but kind of launch.
When to really push them into company-wide investigation.
Yeah, when to use
Yeah.
the EEOC, because when is the tipping point? Because to me, a lot of what is discussed here is also predicated on some maybe like group complaints, but also individual complaints, and to what degree, when it's so difficult to get even one worker to speak up on such a sensitive issue of sexual harassment or racism on the job, like I would just be interested in exploring what is that really like on the ground tied to the organizing. When is the tipping point where you utilize the agency? Because beyond even an individual response on a case we filed with the EEOC might not yield a systemic
Right,
change.
it won't, it's one person complaint, right?
So that's
Yeah.
really scary,
Yeah.
particularly for issues like that.
Right, I mean, the EEOC is not gonna give you systemic change, it just won't happen.
Right, and
So-
so my question is, where does it fit in the much more, the broader organizing drive? Yeah.
Do you wanna compare though, what she's asking isn't just about the EEOC, it's like in general.
Yeah,
She's
definitely.
asking about that,
About when?
right?
About,
When you decide that a case should be pushed to try to expand it to getting lots of complainants and organizing the workplace. And so what we would say is that, I mean, you should, but
Yeah.
we would say that when you think it's an employer who, if you bring down the hammer hard, it will not only help all the workers in that restaurant or that warehouse, but it will go out, word will go out in the sector more broadly. If that is the case, then you want to come down hard. And the other thing is, if you have found that that company is vulnerable for certain reasons. And so one of the things that we teach is how to do industry analysis, how to do research on the company so that you know what some of their vulnerabilities are, so that you know that they will be a good target because they are vulnerable to you, right? So that's the idea. So if it's one worker and she's trying to get her severance check after she left, and it's a very small employer, right? she deserves that money, and the others at that small employer do too. But in terms of trying to create a ripple effect across the sector, so in San Francisco, there was a restaurant in Chinatown, and they couldn't get a single worker to complain. And the investigators went to this restaurant. It was one of the biggest restaurants in Chinatown, hundreds of workers. And they asked the workers, many of them monolingual Chinese, Mandarin speakers, and said, is anything, are there bad things happening, right? Are you not being paid, or are you being paid for overtime? And they refused to come forward. But the Chinese Progressive Association knew that a lot of workers were having problems. And they went door to door, and they worked with the base. And in the end, they had almost 100 workers come forward with complaints. And they collected about $4 million, right? But that is an example of where investigators could not get a single worker to talk to them. And then when the organization went and spent 2 months knocking on doors, they ended up with 100 workers coming forward.
And that case was particularly significant because it was one of the most famous dim sum restaurants in San Francisco, right? It was an institution, and so it sent a message throughout all of the Chinatown specifically that the agencies are looking at, not just front of the house, but back of the house workers. And so you've got the ripple effects, as part of all of the work, because it was like 2 or 3 year campaign of, that eventually ended in settlement.
I didn't really follow up, but yeah.
Are there ways to train members to become quote unquote certified investigators?
So in California, in Los Angeles, there was, and there still is a program through the Department of Public Works. And they deputize union representatives to be able to go on to non-union work sites. So they can go on any work site where Public Works in the LA Unified School District are going on, and do kind of impromptu investigation and talk to workers. I have written about it a lot, and I've raised it everywhere I go. But the interesting thing is that the non-union employers also like it, because the non-union employers that want to make sure that everyone is paying prevailing wage, because otherwise they get underbid. It's unfair competition because, so it works in the public sector because it is in the employer's interests who are bidding on jobs to have those investigators, right? But the idea of deputizing is another thing that we could experiment with, right? That I think we should experiment with, right, in other sectors. So, for example, New Labor for years has been doing this, right, in construction, right, with the promotoras, right, with the
Safety liaisons.
Yeah, with the safety liaisons who get lots and lots of training. They get their OSHA 10 certification. So the question is, what could we do to do that kind of stuff, but where the state is not just indifferent, but is actually supportive of what would it look like if the state actually supported those kinds of initiatives, right? And that kind of thing. But yes, there is deputization. And I interviewed investigators in that system, the people who work for the LA Unified School District, and they all told me in the beginning they hated it because they were afraid it was going to interfere with their work, get in the way of them doing their job, maybe even threaten them, their job down the line. That it was like privatization. And they all ended up telling me, all of them that I talked to, and all the people at the top in the agency, that they love the program. Because they said they could never get to all the workplaces, that most of their investigation was looking at shoddy materials and not at how workers were treated, and that this gave them a whole other workforce to do this kind of investigation. And that they didn't have language capacity. And that by deputizing all these other people, all of a sudden they had, Tagalog, and they had, all these different dialects, and they had, it was like completely blew open what they could do. Anyway, so, yes.
We started those kind of conversations in terms of the implementation of wage theft, not like no structure or anything like that, but it was just mentioned, and definitely know that the DOL in New Jersey has thought about it.
Yeah,
But like how to get there,
Yeah.
what are the steps we need to
Yeah.
propose to create something like that?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll talk about
yeah.
today, but.
What I'll tell you is that the issue, I mean, we can talk about this a lot more, but what happened in LA was that, and what happens in other places is that you can establish standards for who should be allowed to be deputized or who should be allowed to be hired. And they may decide they're gonna license people, and then you're competing with for-profits that decide to get in the game too, doing monitoring. So, what's interesting is that in California a few years ago, they abolished their labor monitoring program, because it had turned out that it was all of these people who just hung out a shingle, you know, to do labor monitoring. So we should just talk about what would it look like, right? And I think we could say it has to be a worker representative, by which we mean, right? A nonprofit organization that is working in these ways, right? And that what they are, you know, we could specify what they are doing and what standards they are enforcing. And if that is what was done in Austin, Texas by the Workers' Defense Project, they have this Better Builders certification. And the Better Builders certification says that the city of Austin can require builders to show that they have done certain things on their work sites to certify that workers are not being exploited. But it is very difficult to do that enforcement if you are not the Workers' Defense Project,
Yeah.
right? So I have written about a lot of these cases, and you can read about them. I could send you papers where I've sort of described these programs in depth.
We only have
Yeah, go ahead.
40 minutes left, so
Go ahead.
maybe, so unless there's any questions about, just because I think we really want to
Yeah.
get to the brainstorming, any questions about these tools?
Well, I think you should talk about investigation and company-wide stuff.
Okay,
Some
so,
of the other things, site visits, the joint employment stuff, I don't know, some of them.
okay. Does New Jersey do company-wide investigations always?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Like
by-
if they get a minimum wage complaint, do they only investigate for the complainant, or do they investigate firm-wise?
I think they go firm-wide,
Firm-wide, okay, right, so
but
that.
just records.
Right, just reference. Well, so that's important. Not all agencies look at the entire firm. They only investigate for the complainant, which obviously, like EEOC, that doesn't do anything for systemic change. It only addresses that one person's issue. So it's not helpful. Okay. The other, site visits, right? So not only should the agency be doing employee interviews, they should be showing up at the workplace to look at and to see what's happening, to interview the employers, the managers, and to really see what is going on the ground. In relation to that, in some cases, and this happens in the case that Janice was talking about with the Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, is surveillance, right? If you're working, especially if you have employees who may not want to give you information, if you can spend a lot of resources on a really important case, where you have investigators showing up when employees are getting to the job site and can document that and document when they're leaving the job site, you have objective evidence of how many hours those people are working, right? So you don't even need employee interviews in those situations if you have really vulnerable workers who aren't going to be interviewed. You have objective evidence to base not only the finding of violation on, but the damages, right? And so that's really resource intensive, but it's super important in very specific cases. Joint employment, we've talked a little bit about joint employment, but joint employment is where a person may have more than one employer, right? So they could be working for a temp agency and get assigned to a bigger, another company to do administrative assistant work. It could be
They know this very well because of
Yeah.
warehouse work
Yeah.
and all kinds of stuff.
right? So joint employment, and you guys know this, like joint employment is a really important part of strategic enforcement, and you know this too, but the reason is you want to get the person with the most money on the hook, so you can actually get money from somebody, but you also want to get the entity with the most to lose on the hook, right? So if you can get the Cheesecake Factory, this was a case out of California where in the janitorial case, they got the Cheesecake Factory on the hook for subcontractor subcontractors, violations against janitorial workers. Cheesecake Factory is the only firm in that chain that anybody knows, right? So they have the most to lose and the most money. And so through joint employment, you're going to have more ripple effects, and you're also going to be able to recover more money. So that's super important. I think, yeah.
Okay, so I will say a little bit about co-enforcement, Yaro, is that okay? You sure? Okay. So the argument that we try to make to agencies is that they cannot do strategic enforcement without working with you, right? Without working with organizations. And then we say why, right? We say that it is not just about there being not enough inspectors, investigators, but that investigators don't know what workers and worker organizations know. So the idea is that for strategic enforcement to work, workers and worker organizations have to play a central role, and that they know things that government does not know. So we know, right, that workers have a presence at the work site every day. They know what the actual conditions of work are and not what the employer is telling the investigator, right? They know about employer practices regarding clocking in and out, and hours really worked, and payment and employment practices. They know how many workers are actually employed versus what the employer is telling the agency, right? They know who's really supervising the work, right? So that if it's up the chain liability, they know that, yeah, there's this contractor signing the paycheck, but you know, the Gap is in there every day, right? Or Minute Maid is in there every day, or right, whoever the big growers are, right, or whatever. And they know how employer behavior has changed over time. And to your question, Anna, they know other workers, right? So they know what's happening. They talk to each other, right? So when we talk to agencies, we make the case about how can they do strategic enforcement if they don't have a way to get to workers? And here is the argument that we make about organizations. We say, if you want the information that workers have, you have to work with the organizations that workers trust. If you want the information that workers have, you have to work with the organizations that workers trust. Right? So that's the argument. And then we talk to them a lot about why they have to make sure that the flow of information and resources is happening to organizations, right? That they have to share information and that they have to share resources. So one of the first things that the Commissioner of Labor in California did when she got there was she brought in the community organizations from the different sectors to train the investigators in what was going on in their industries, right? So, for example, imagine if, CATA was training the investigators about what's going on with farm work, and New Labor was training the investigators about how to think about warehousing or construction, right? And Make the Road was training about the sectors that it knows so well, right? And United for Respect was teaching them about retail, right? Like, imagine if early on, or if 32BJ was training them about all the schemes in janitorial work, right? That's what happened in California, right? These groups came in and did this training, okay? And then they set up 6 task forces in California by industry. They said all of our training, they said all of our strategic enforcement, all of our investigation is going to be in partnership with community groups. Yeah.
They did the presentation to pitch the model, or did they do the presentation after the regulatory framework was there?
So here's the thing, the regulatory framework is there now, right? There's nothing that says you can't do co-enforcement with the agency right now. It was about political will, right? So it's true that one of the things that the Commissioner of Labor did in California was that she assessed, she had been a lawyer at one of the organizations, like she was like a Keith there, right? So she knew the ins and outs of why workers were getting screwed there. And when Governor Brown first approached her, she said, "You're never gonna make me Commissioner of Labor, but if you were, here's what I would do." And she laid out her plan for what she would do. And at the end, he said, "I want you to do it, and I'll cover you. You know, I'll protect you." So she came in and she just basically really brought it, right? So she pushed all the way up to the limit in terms of what she could do. And then she would go back to the legislature every year for the power she felt she needed that she didn't have. Supported by a coalition of organizations that worked on these issues like you guys did, right? So here's what they did. They targeted the sectors that had the highest rates of wage theft: agriculture, janitorial, home health care, car wash, hotel, warehousing, and restaurants. And in the old days, investigators would just do randomized sweeps. But what they did in this case was they created task forces. They built partnerships. They did the research together, and then they did the investigations together, right? So she calls it strategic co-enforcement. That is what, and here is what she says about it. She says, one of the best ways we've established for finding violations is to work with community-based organizations who already have the trust of workers, speak the language of workers, understand how violations occur and are often masked, and are willing to collaborate with us by giving us leads and bridge the gap. So I'll just tell you that in our experience, what agencies need to do good work with community groups is solid cases. And a lot of what we hear from the agencies is that they don't get cases at all from organizations, or that the cases they get are not strong. Now, obviously, we know sometimes that's not true, right? It's BS. But sometimes they believe that the cases have not been well prepared. So you have this situation where the organization is mad because the agency is not going forward with a case, and the agency says that it was really poorly researched, right? The agencies always talk about preserving confidentiality, but the irony about this, let's say it's new labor, right? Or make the road, right? Or brand workers, or laundry workers, right? You get the workers. You have the relationship with them. They go to the agency because you help them file a complaint. And then the agency turns around and says, "I can't tell you because I'm protecting the confidentiality of the worker who you fucking brought to them," right? Makes no sense, right? So it's like getting them to, it's like challenging them on what is confidentiality in that example, right? So you have a paper there that's all about how they can do information sharing, right? While they're respecting confidentiality. Now the other one is hard, right? And that's that agencies, really they tell us that there are some groups they work closely with and others that they won't because they feel that they've been publicly burned. And so I think that one of the things for you guys is that you are facing a choice where you're gonna have to hit them really hard to get them to adopt these practices. But the issue is that if you hit them too hard, you know, they may say, well, we don't trust them and we're not gonna work with them, right? And I understand that that is a dance, right? And that you now have a new administration, and maybe, I know they're not so new now, but maybe you can do these things with them, right? But that is what, behind the scenes, agencies will tell me, oh yeah, I share information with some organizations, but not if they've, not if they've beat me up, right? You know, that kind of thing. And what organizations say is that they have to preserve the trust of workers. So sometimes agencies get frustrated when a worker decides not to come forward with a case, right? Not to actually do it. And the organization says, listen, I can't force a worker to go forward with a case if they don't want to do it. That's not, that they need to understand, agencies need to understand that the organizations need them to share information with them to preserve their credibility. And when Jen was describing to you about Seattle or San Francisco or LA, sometimes these organizations do get funding to do outreach, but the contracts are ridiculous. right? So that people have to document every leaflet they gave out, right? And it's little bits of money, so huge amounts of paperwork for tiny contracts, and they have to, right? So we try to say to the agencies, this is nickeling and diming your most important partner. This is not the way to handle a relationship, right? This is not the way to do it. This will give you an example of what I mean. I talk about this in terms of thin versus thick co-enforcement. So thin co-enforcement is when the contract is only for canvassing, right? Businesses. When they say to the organization, we're giving you this money to distribute this flyer and only this flyer. You can't talk about your organization, you can't recruit for your organization, you can't talk about immigration, right? That's just ridiculous. When they only support them to do outreach, but they're not allowed to play a role during the complaint, investigation, or settlement processes, right? Like imagine if there's a settlement with a big company and you guys got the contract to do the monitoring, compliance monitoring. Or you guys got the contract to do the training of the workers for the next 2 years, once a month. And you got paid to do that, right?
By the employer.
By the employer, right? That's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, right? That's the only way that we're gonna be able to win the kind of systemic change that we need. So the idea is, thick co-enforcement is when the contracts are for a longer amount of time, they're broader, when the it recognizes that the organization needs to talk about its work, and where the agency wants to share information. So I'll just leave you with this. I think that a lot of it is about the culture of the agency. When these laws were passed, they were passed by strong labor movements and strong women's organizations that were anti-sweatshop, right? And strong religious organizations. That's how these laws came to be, just like what you did, right? That's where these laws come from. And the people who were the early directors of these agencies came out of our movements. They came out of the labor movement. They came out of, the equivalent of worker centers and, religious organizations, right? They were reformers. They were on fire for worker justice. Now, sometimes when I talk to agencies, when we talk to agencies, they tell us, I am an umpire. I am a neutral, right? My job is not to be on anyone's side, right? What was so powerful about what's happened in California is that the commissioner there says, I am not neutral. This is the workers' law, right? I am enforcing the workers' law, right? That is what we need in New Jersey, right? We need that same stance on the part of the agency, right? This phony neutrality. No. These laws are workers' laws, and we have to fight for them to be aggressively and unapologetically enforced. So we will come down now and just sit and talk and brainstorm with you, okay? Cool. Is that what you want us to do?
Beautiful. What do you guys think? Yeah. So we have a little bit of time. Of course, we scheduled it to 4:30. You can always leave. If we go over a little bit, is that okay with Janice and Jen?
Yes.
For those that can stay a little bit longer, I think what we might want to do is kind of move us around. Is that okay? I'm seeing I don't know. I kind of like that whiteboard more than this whiteboard. I'll move the food over. Can you guys, I think maybe this table, if you can come over here. You guys are okay. We're just going to turn around and brainstorm. I was just going to move the table.
Puedo utilizar aquella tabla blanca.
This was great.
Okay.
I'd always prefer to the EEOC, but I like our new PCR. So I'm beginning to prefer more. That's Division on Civil Rights.
I know, right? What?
Something I'm doing a lot of.
Again?
Some
I want
easier also.
Que se sientan muy lejos.